Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're so excited to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm very personally excited for this. Oh, of course, it just got dark. My lighting was so good. Anyway, the sun will come back. My name is McKaylee. I'm the Director of Marketing and Events here at Tattered Cover Bookstore. And by here, I mean figuratively, because I am in my guest bedroom. But thank you guys for joining us with this online community. We're so excited to have you guys here. We've been doing really well at featuring all different types of authors from all different genres on these virtual events. And we're able to keep doing it because of you and because you're watching and because you continue to buy books from us. The book that we're featuring today, Amazon Women, there's links in the description below that you can also purchase that book online from us. Just a couple of quick updates about Tattered Cover. You can now do curbside pickup. If you live in the Denver metro area or you're willing to drive anywhere to come to our Colfax Avenue location, we are doing curbside pickup now. Our website is also open 24/7 now, so that's really exciting. That means you can shop anytime. We don't have limited hours anymore because we're catching up on orders. And thank you guys so much for continuing to inundate us with your love and support through books and purchasing them. And so we're planning plenty of more live streams. We have a couple coming up next week. For any of you fiction readers out there, we've got Kristen Arnett, whose book Mostly Dead Things we're going to be hosting her on Monday at 5 o'clock Mountain Time on Instagram. And then the next day, on Tuesday, May 19th, we'll be back here on YouTube with Hadar Viram with Yesterday's Monsters for any of you true crime Manson family friends. My fans is what I was trying to say, true crime fans, but you knew what I meant. I want to just also quickly say, we've been saying this at the beginning of all of our live streams of why we're doing this. You know, art is a survival resource, and it's something that's vitally important and has very few safety nets, especially in crises like this. And we're here to affirm that creative work is essential and we want to elevate it. It's always going to be our top priority. You know, the authors that we've chosen to do our virtual live streams, we choose them because we love their work and we can't stand the idea of them not having a platform right now. And we think that you're going to love it too. And we believe entirely that our communities need books as much as independent bookstores need our neighbor's business right now. And while we are normally a community space, physically, we can't be that right now. So we're choosing to do this virtually. And we just can't thank you enough for continuing to help us grow this community, even though it's online and virtual. We hope that you still get a very similar effect out of it. But I want to talk about the author that we have today. Let's just be real, this is an extraordinary woman right here. She is incredible. And Darcy Gaechter was the first and only woman to kayak the Amazon River from source to sea. She's been whitewater kayaking for 21 years, and for the past 15 years, she's been considered one of the world's best female kayakers and one of the most accomplished expedition kayakers. The author of The Kayaker's Guide to Ecuador and numerous articles about whitewater kayaking, the guiding business, and river conservation, Darcy has been honing her adventure writing skills for years. This combined with her MA in environmental history has given her a solid background in researching, academic writing, and travel writing from popular media. And her new book, Amazon Woman, is no exception. I'm so excited to have Darcy join us today, and I'm going to be asking her to join me. I'm going to have her turn on her video and her microphone. Here we go. Ta-da. There she is. You just have to turn on your microphone or unmute. I can unmute you. There you are.
I think I'm set now.
Yeah, hello.
Hello. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate you putting this on, and for all the folks listening in, I appreciate you guys taking your time to support me, to support Tattered Cover. This is awesome.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for being here. Thank you for joining us in this crazy crisis. But, you know, like I said before, we're trying to do this virtually, and we definitely think that your amazing book and this amazing feat that you accomplished deserve some kind of platform. You have a presentation for us, yes? To start us off?
Yes. Should I dive right in here?
Yeah, I'm going to hop on off and let you take control, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A after Darcy's presentation.
All right, sounds awesome. Let me get my slideshow going here. All right, cool. Yeah, thank you guys so much for coming out. I'm going to start my talk with a little disclaimer that this is a photo of me doing what I feel really comfortable doing. talking like this in front of people, even though you're not actually physically in front of me, is really nerve-wracking for me. So I'll try to talk slow and not rush through this, but thanks for your patience if I seem a little bit nervous. So what I'm here to talk about tonight is a really long river journey. In 2013, I became the first woman to kayak the Amazon River from source to sea, and I was with David Midgley and Dawn Beveridge, and our team of 3 became a team to actually kayak the entire river. And yeah, so before I get too much into the story, I want to introduce the river because it plays a big part in my story. And the Amazon River is more than 4,000 miles long. And that's more than 1,000 miles longer than the distance from New York City to San Francisco. And there's huge debate in the geographic world about whether the Nile or the Amazon is the world's largest river. And that is an unsettled point at this time. But everyone does agree that the Amazon is the world's largest river by volume. It holds 20% of the world's fresh water, and it's bigger than the next 6 biggest rivers on Earth combined. So stop to think about that for a minute. It's actually, I think, really hard to imagine this much water, to imagine a river that you can't even see across, because most of us don't have any frame of reference for this. But I think we're all, especially those of us living in the Western US, are pretty familiar with the Colorado River in the Grand Canyon, which this is a picture of. And this is a big river for Western US standards. And low water in the Grand Canyon, which is what this is about 7,000 cubic feet per second. And low water in the Amazon River is 7.5 million cubic feet per second. So this is actually a photo of the river. This is not the ocean. And it's just truly a mind-boggling amount of water. So people often want to know, like, what was it like doing this journey from the source to the sea? And so the whole journey took us 148 days, and it's really hard to sum up what it was like starting on a river that started out 5 inches wide and finished on something that looked like this. But I'll try to do my best to explain that a little bit tonight, but I kind of want to set the overall feeling of what this was like. So I'm sure that everyone listening in tonight has had like a really long, tiring day, a day that just left you feeling totally drained. And you know, whether you got there from a fun activity or from work or just from life in general, I'm sure we can all relate to just being totally beaten down at the end of the day. So imagine that feeling, and then throw in oppressive heat and dehydration and millions of bugs. And then add to that that one of your 2 kayaking partners, or one of the 2 people that you spend every waking moment with, tells you that he has no emotional intelligence, and so you can't get mad at him for being a jerk. And that guy was David Midgley, who I'll call Midge for the rest of the talk. And he's on the right with the blue boat. Then there's me in the middle, and Dawn is on the left side of the screen. So this was our team of 3. The guy without the kayak on the far left is the landowner where we started our expedition. And so then when I explain the journey in those terms, people are like, why would you want to do this to yourself? Why spend 5 months kayaking across South America and putting up with a lot of suffering? And this is actually a hard question. I don't think even now, it's been 7 years since the expedition, I don't think I have a great answer. But I'll start the answer with a quote from Oprah Winfrey, because, you know, who doesn't love Oprah quotes? She was recently on The Daily Show with Trevor Noah, and he asked her, because obviously she comes in contact with a lot of successful people. And Trevor asked Oprah, what is the common characteristic of successful people? And this is a quote. This was Oprah's answer: that people get to where they want to go because they know where they are going. A lot of people are going and being driven by what they think they should do, what other people want them to do, or what they've held in their minds for a long time that they ought to do. But the most important thing you could ever ask yourself is, what do I really want? And so I really liked this definition of success because it was very different than any that I had heard before. And it seemed very simple, but obviously knowing what you want isn't always that simple. But I was pretty lucky because I knew from an early age, from my early 20s, that what I wanted to do was kayak, to travel the world in a little plastic boat and have adventures. And now I'm sure this is not what Oprah was talking about when she said this to Trevor, but this was my thing. This is what I wanted to do. And I had a successful kayaking business where I got to share my passion with people that I guided on rivers throughout the world. I had kayaked some of the world's hardest rivers. So, in some regards, I was successful and I was lucky. I was living out my passions. But on the other hand, my passion, kayaking, was seen by a lot of people as like a not a legitimate or an inappropriate thing to do, especially the older I got. And so I was constantly getting questions like, when was I going to grow up? When would I get a real job and stop playing around all the time? Didn't I want some security for the future? And these kind of questions. But kayaking and adventures had a really strong hold on me, and I really wasn't interested in these other parts of life that everyone else seemed to think that I should be interested in. So I started to feel like something must be wrong with me. And I started to look at the Amazon expedition as a like the big final adventure that could satisfy all my adventuresome cravings and allow me to finally start doing all these things that everyone else wanted me to do. So that was kind of the twisted thing I got going in my brain before this expedition, that it could finally be the thing to set me free and allow me to do what everyone else wanted me to do. Now, how did I end up doing this expedition in the first place? So, this idea to kayak the entire Amazon was born out of David Midgley's midlife crisis. So, he is a really brilliant computer programmer. He lives in London, and he, around his mid 30s, was sort of having this crisis of feeling like he was going to waste his entire life sitting behind a computer writing code and not be out experiencing the world. So he was kind of having the opposite life crisis that I was having. But he decided like one big adventure would be enough for him. And so he scoured the adventure archives, and he thought about climbing Everest, thought about sailing around the world, but thought that both of those had been overdone. And he somehow stumbled upon the Amazon River. And he learned that nobody had kayaked it yet. And at the point where he was making his plan, 5 people had descended the Amazon from source to sea, and they had walked around or rafted the whitewater section. So no one had kayaked the whole thing. And then Midge read that more people had walked on the moon than had descended the Amazon from source to sea. And that did it for him. He was absolutely sold when he learned that. But there were a couple problems. Number one was that Midge didn't know how to kayak, and he had actually never even sat in a kayak before when he came up with this idea. He had also never camped out before. He was not an athlete or an adventurer, but he decided this is what he was going to do. So he learned how to kayak in London through his local kayak and canoe club. And then he started branching out. And that's how he found Dawn and I, or Dawn and me. We were running, and we still run, Small World Adventures, a whitewater kayak guiding business in Ecuador. And Midge read on our website that we had instruction for total beginners up to class 5 kayakers. And class 5 is the most difficult runnable classification of whitewater. So Midge started coming to Ecuador so that we could train him to be able to survive the whitewater in the Amazon headwaters, because he knew there was going to be some class 5 kayaking that had to be done. And so for 8 years, he came to Ecuador. Sometimes he stayed 2 weeks, sometimes he stayed as long as 2 months, and we helped him build the skills to be able to do this. And I want to introduce Dawn real quick. Dawn Beveridge. Oh, sorry. This is Midge surviving the whitewater in the Amazon headwaters, but I'll get back to that in a little bit. This is Dawn, and Dawn has dedicated most of his life to kayaking, and he is really good at it. And he's also a really good and patient teacher. And him spending time with Midge, getting on board with this plan and training Midge to actually develop these expedition skills were a huge help in the Amazon expedition. And after 8 years of visiting us in Ecuador every winter, Midge decided he was ready. We agreed with him, and he invited us to go with him. And so we set off on our expedition at the end of July 2013, and our first chore was to find the source of the Amazon. Because from about 1950 until 2012, the world pretty much agreed that the Apurimac River was the source of the Amazon. And in 2012, a guy named Rocky Contos discovered that the Montaro River was about 47 miles longer. So both these rivers are in Peru, but different drainages. And so we switched plans to the Montaro, but then we still had to find the source of the Montaro. So we traced the feeder streams of the Montaro up the mountainside to that lake that I was showing earlier. That lake was about just under 15,000 feet in elevation. Then we paddled across the lake and then hiked up the mountainside looking for the highest elevation flowing water that we could find. And this is what we found. This is Dawn and Midge standing over the Amazon River when it's just a few inches wide. And then we began our expedition, and we all set off on this expedition like mentally prepared for certain things like heat and bugs and flat water and being bored. We didn't really think too much about how cold it might be at 15,000 feet in Peru. And this is Dawn and I waking up one morning to find our socks and our shoes completely frozen. For about the first week, our water bottles would freeze solid every night, and we definitely were suffering in the cold a bit before we started suffering in the heat. The early part of the Amazon was irrigation ditches like this. We were in the high elevation grasslands of Peru. And then eventually we got to some industrial areas. Unfortunately, the headwaters of the Amazon are not very clean. They don't have the same kind of environmental regulations that we do or did. This is a copper mine that we paddled through. And then we got to a lime mine. And at this point, the entire river actually went underground for almost 2 miles. And so we had to walk our boats around the mine until the river came back up. There was also these mining towns that supported this. There was a smelter here that processed zinc, lead, and copper. And there's not a ton of trash service. We shouldn't take our garbage men and women for granted because a lot of the trash there just ends up in the river. It's the easiest thing to do with it. But after a week or so, we started to get more water, which helped with the pollution. It also made it feel much more like a normal river. We started dropping into some of the canyon sections and getting into the real whitewater. And right about the point that the whitewater got hard, we said goodbye to our support van. So for the first 10 days, we had a support van that could meet up with us pretty much every night, and they would carry our gear for us during the day while we were kayaking. So we got to kayak in empty boats. After 10 days, the Montaro River drops into a little crack in the earth and it gets into a super remote part of the Andes Mountains. So we said goodbye to our support van, which meant that we now had to carry everything that we needed in our kayaks. So camping gear, water filtration, first aid, food, extra clothes, extra gear like spare paddles, satellite phones, passports, anything that we might need, we had to shove in these little kayaks, which definitely makes them harder to paddle. And yeah, so we were a little bit bummed to leave our support van, but what we lost in maneuverability and comfort, we definitely gained in amazing remote camp spots. So all in all, the Amazon had about 25 days of whitewater, and 14 to 15 of those days were class 5 whitewater. And we also paddled through a fairly scary construction site where they're building a new dam, and that is a dump truck in the river on the right side of the screen. And Midge did amazingly well. You know, some people spend their entire lives kayaking and they never get to a class 5 level. And this guy, this non-athlete computer geek guy, dedicated himself, his mind, his body to this, and he paddled all the rapids. He survived 2 weeks of the hardest whitewater in the world, and he really did an amazing job. after the 25 days of whitewater, we got to the flat water, and we were doing a little bit of calculation. During our 25-day whitewater descent, we dropped um, 13,000 feet in elevation. And so that meant that we lost 85% of our gradient in only 17% of our trip. And so this told us that we were going to have a very flat paddle out. But luckily, we got sea kayaks delivered. So this is a little tiny town of Puerto N.A. And we got our 17-foot long sea kayaks brought here. And so we could switch out of our much slower whitewater kayaks. And then we paddled off into what Peru calls their red zone. And this is sort of a notoriously dangerous area. And it's dangerous for a number of reasons, but mainly because the local indigenous people who live there are called the Ashanika, and they are very rightfully so afraid of outsiders and protective of their people, their land. And for a long time, starting back from the Franciscan missionaries and the rubber boom into more recent times, during the 1980s and 1990s, when the Shining Path terrorist movement was very active in Peru, they spent a lot of time in these jungle regions, and they killed a lot of Ashanika people in what they call now Peru's Civil War. And now there's also a ton of drug trafficking in this area. In 2013, Peru overtook Colombia as the world's #1 cocaine exporting and producing region in the world, or country in the world. There's also illegal logging that goes on here. There's actually mahogany trees in this forest, and the loggers can get like $10,000 to $15,000 for a single tree. And some of the watchdog groups believe that 80% of the wood harvested in this area is done illegally. And so there's all these factors at play, and there's not a ton of police or military presence, and they don't do a very good job of sticking up for the indigenous people. So rightfully so, the indigenous people are fearful, and they have killed a number of outsiders who came into their territory. And I was actually so afraid of paddling through this zone that before we got there, I stopped in a little village up in the whitewater section and had a lady in a haircutting place cut all my hair off, because I decided in my brain that a group of 3 dudes would look like less of a target than 2 guys and a girl. But this is the Peruvian Navy, and they ended up escorting us for about 10 days in this zone, and they wouldn't come upriver into the heart of the red zone for reasons that we didn't totally understand, but they did give us an escort for the second half of the red zone. And we ended up having nothing but good experiences throughout the entire red zone. And I think in large part because we got permission letters from the Ashanika people before we went there. And these letters served to warn them that we were coming and to explain to them what we were doing. Like, it was very important that they didn't see us as a threat. And probably luck had a lot to do with it too, but we all made it through the red zone unscathed. I'm just trying to watch my time a little bit here because I want to make sure to leave time for your guys' questions. So we got out of the red zone 60 days into the expedition. And so during the whitewater part, we had really good team cohesion because we were all trying to work through the whitewater, make sure Midge got through the whitewater. And then when we got to the red zone, again, we had this external threat of all the scary people in the red zone. So we were bonding as a team for that. And then when we got out of the red zone, like, we lacked that external threat, and we got kind of bored, and we started fighting a lot more with each other. And so it became really important to us to try to see little things every day that would make us happy, make us feel that it was worthwhile being on the Amazon. And we were able to do that, luckily. This is a pink Amazonian river dolphin. And I took this picture, but here's one from a professional photographer so you can see what they really look like. So we saw these guys almost every single day, which was an excellent morale booster. There's tons of traffic on the Amazon River, so we always had interesting boats to look at, like logging barges, little kids in their own boats, giant super tankers. And the Amazon River is actually quite populated too. So we pass villages and towns and even cities quite frequently. This is the city of Iquitos, Peru, and it's the largest town in the world or largest city in the world that you cannot drive to. So you can get there by boat, you can get there by airplane, and there's 500,000 people that live here. We also saw interesting floating trash, which was always entertaining, and amazing sunsets. So even though things got hard and we were bored and we were having a hard time as a group, we always found something to be thankful for being on the river. Um, about, let's see, we had maybe a month to go. We started hitting these really massive daily storms. And at this point, it was already kind of constantly windy, and the wind was always blowing upriver, so that if we stopped paddling, we would just get blown back up the river. But when the storms came, it was always more intense. And one really cool thing about this is that there's howler monkeys in the forest down there, and we would hear the howler monkeys start their cry and get really agitated, and then always about 5 minutes after that, the storm would come, and we'd get hit with lightning, wind, rain. Sometimes it was rain so hard that the visibility would get cut down to like 10 feet, which was nerve wracking because we were sharing the river with really big boats at this point. But I think it also added a welcome surge of adrenaline to our otherwise kind of boring existence at that point. This is the meeting of the waters near Manaus, and the right side of the screen is the Rio Negro, and the left side, the brown water, is the Rio Amazonas. And because of differences in water temperature and sediment load, these two rivers don't mix. So even 30 miles downstream of the confluence, you can still see a distinct line. Eventually, we got so close to the ocean that like there wasn't any longer a high water line dictated by the rainy or the dry season. We had high tide and low tide now. Tides come up the Amazon River more than 600 miles. And as we got closer to the ocean, the entire landscape and architecture was dictated by these tides. There wasn't any longer like much solid ground, so there was mud flats and mangroves. And so everybody had to build their house on stilts, and the tidal exchange was about 15 feet. So every day the tide would come up 15 feet and drop 15 feet twice a day. So everyone had to build on these boardwalks to accommodate that. And we also realized that we couldn't paddle against the tides. When we first hit them, they weren't so strong and we could paddle against them a bit. But as we got closer to the ocean, it kind of became not worth our effort to paddle against the tides. So every day we'd have to sit somewhere for 6 hours, and we'd often stop at these villages, and people are always very kind to us. And even though they thought we were crazy and weird, they always let us hang out on their docks for 6 hours. And this guy is building shrimp traps here. And this is still in the river, not too close to the ocean yet. And so these are freshwater shrimp they're catching. And eventually we got really close to the ocean. And this is where we camped out on our last night before finishing the expedition. And from this very comfortable looking rock, we had 10 miles to go to our ending point in the ocean. And we had to sit on this rock in the morning for about 5 hours because the tide was coming in when we woke up. But eventually we started paddling. And like I said, it was only 10 miles, but because of the rough conditions, it took us about 6 hours to make it. And before we started the expedition, we had pre-programmed a little point in the GPS that was our ending point. And you can see the water's blue now because we're out in the Atlantic and we're done with the muddy Amazon water, and you can't see land anywhere in sight. But once we crossed our little point, the ocean was so rough that we couldn't really stop and have any kind of celebration, like not even a high five or anything. So it was kind of this undramatic moment out in the ocean of like, yeah, okay, we crossed this invisible point on the GPS. Now let's paddle to shore. And we were about 2 miles offshore at this point. So we turned and paddled in, and we were treated to this beautiful white sand beach overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. Awesome sunset, no people anywhere. And after 4,300 miles and 148 days, We estimate over 2 million paddle strokes. We became the first group to kayak the entire Amazon River. Midge became the first British person to kayak the Amazon. I became the first woman and the first vegan to do it. And Don became the first guy to kayak the Amazon because his girlfriend made him. All right, guys, thanks everyone so much for listening. I am going to turn off my screen share, and then hopefully some of you have some questions for me.
That was amazing. I mean, like, I read the book, but just the pictures bring a whole different, because I listened to it on audiobook. So
oh yeah, all right.
Brings a whole different element getting to see the pictures.
Nice.
That's amazing. Sorry, I'm in awe. I'm not an athletic person. I'm a theater kid. Athlete was like fake sword fighting. And like, and I lived in Colorado my whole life, and everybody's like, how are you not an outdoorsy person? And I'm like, I'm not, but I'm amazed by wow, it's just so cool. It's so
thank
amazing.
you. Thanks so
much.
Yeah.
So anybody who has questions, you can type your questions out in the chat that we have on the video there. I'm going to start us off with if you could give us a little bit of insight, like what prep work went into this? Because you were talking about writing letters to people. You were talking about, Mitch never had a kayak before in his life. Like the money, what kind of prep time went into these 148 days?
Yeah, so the logistics on this trip were pretty insane. And so the prep work on Midge's end, it truly was a decade of prepping for him. And honestly, most of that time was spent learning how to kayak and getting good at it. But he did some funny things along the way. Like he lived in London and used public transportation, so he didn't even have a driver's license. But he realized if he wanted to be a kayaker and drive his kayak to the river, that he'd have to get a driver's license. So at 33 years old or something, he went and got a driver's license. He wanted to get in good shape, so he signed himself up for some marathons so that would force him to go running. And he found kayaking really, really scary. So he took up skydiving too, so he could find something in the world scarier than kayaking to like change his perspective a little bit about kayaking. So yeah, his preparation was a lot like that. Oh, he also took jungle survival courses and did some other stuff like that. And then, me and Dawn were pretty well prepared for the whitewater because that's what we did all the time. And logistically speaking, Midge did a lot of work. He did a lot of research on what was the best sea kayak, how is he going to get it to Peru. He found a woman in Lima that he called the fixer, and she was really helpful in doing things like importing the sea kayaks to Peru, for example, and stuff like that. And then we all flew to Lima like 6 days before we were going to start the expedition. Mm-hmm. And those 6 days, it was like 5 a.m. till 11 p.m. almost every day doing preparations. And that's where we got those letters, the permission letters from the Ashanika group. And we talked to the project manager of the construction company that was building that dam to try to get them to stop using dynamite while we paddled through. And then we went to the hardware store to buy lumber to build a rack on the minivan to get the kayaks to the starting point, all kinds of little things like that. And one thing I realized, if I did another trip like that, we felt pretty well prepared physically and logistically. Mm-hmm. But I did like virtually zero like mental preparation, and I didn't really think about like how mentally and emotionally challenging paddling 4 months of flat water, like not at your own pace, not at your own schedule would be. And I'm sure a lot of people out there are like, well, duh, of course it would be hard, but it just didn't occur to me. And so, yeah, I think I learned the most in that regard. Like I was very impatient, and that's like a problem of mine anyway, but I would definitely work more on that next time I was going to do a really long expedition.
I don't know, can it get any longer? Like, is that a legitimate thing? Like, or are you going to do it twice? Like that's
well, yeah, good point. Yeah, it's not going to get any longer on a river unless I guess you could like finish the Amazon and then sea kayak like down the coast of South America and get to another river or something like that. But yeah,
I would
hopefully I won't do a longer one.
No, that's okay. That's fair. So what do you remember your first what is it? Do you remember your first kayaking trip? And was that like the thing that you got bit by the bug that inspired you to move on? Or was it like you had to try it a couple of times and before you really fell in love?
Yeah, I hated kayaking when I first took it up. So I was, let's see, I was 19 when I started kayaking, and I like played a lot of sports in high school and was into like mountain biking and hiking and all that kind of stuff. And I had never really been bad at something. Like my parents taught me how to ski when I was 2. And so like by the time I could remember, like I was already a good skier. And so kayaking was like the first thing in my life that I really sucked at. And I just remember really, really hating that feeling. And but for some reason, like instead of wanting to quit, I just got determined to get good at it. And it took me a while for sure. And like I didn't know how to roll when I started kayaking. So I had these people that would let me go with them, but they weren't that interested in teaching me stuff. So I would go and then tip over and swim and then have to like get my kayak to shore and dump it out. And it was always this huge production. And I was embarrassed because I was like, oh, everyone's so much better than me and I just suck. But then, yeah, I was like, okay, I've got to figure this out. So I went to a pool and learned how to roll. And once I learned how to roll, like the learning curve just got so much better. But I would say I was like maybe 2 years in to my kayaking career when I decided that was the thing for me. And what really made it click was a friend invited me to go to Nepal. And I had never like really had any travel desires before that, but just seeing a different part of the world and doing it from a kayak was really special for me because I really felt like we were getting to see stuff that maybe other tourists weren't, and like just having different experiences with local people on the side of the river. And that trip to Nepal is what really made it click, even though it was actually like a really hard and maybe not such a good trip, but it that's what fueled the fire or set the fire, I guess.
And so, what made you want to turn this into a book? It's an incredible story and it's an incredible accomplishment. But there's definitely, the guys didn't write a book necessarily, like you did. And so, what compelled you to make the story shareable in that format?
Two things, I guess. And yeah, like I think people can't really see me that well. I can't even back up far enough, but I'm like really short and really skinny, and definitely am not what people would think of when they think of like Amazon River Explorer or badass kayaker or anything like that. And the same thing when I was in high school playing sports. Like I really loved volleyball, but I was short. And even though I had like a really high vertical jump and could hit the ball pretty well, like I got overlooked a lot because I was so little. And then in the kayaking world, I was a raft guide for a long time too. And people would always be coming up to me like, I don't want to get in your raft. Like, there's no way you can do this. Or, and even now, like back before coronavirus, I was doing this talk live in Vail. And some guy came up to me beforehand and said, are you the presenter? Because you don't look big enough to kayak the Amazon. And, I'm like, well, I don't even know what to say to that, but you don't have to be big to kayak the Amazon. But anyway, like a
Wow.
lifetime of hearing this kind of stuff kind of had me feeling frustrated. And I feel lucky that I didn't listen to these people.
Yeah.
Their words made me like more determined to prove them wrong. But I do see that a lot of people do listen to stuff like that. And it's kind of just this background noise, but it really does affect people. So I wanted to share my story to like hopefully encourage people, if they have any dream they want to do and people are telling them no or telling them you can't, just try your best not to listen, which it can be hard to do, to tune them out. But so I wanted to share that message. That was one reason. And I had always really liked writing, and I never really thought of writing a book, but after or during this Amazon trip, I was like, well, this might actually be something worth writing a book about. And so it's kind of those two things that sparked me to do it. And It was a huge challenge, that's for sure. Like for me, it was way harder than actually kayaking the Amazon, but
That was someone else's question, was it harder writing a book or kayaking the Amazon?
for sure writing the book. And I would say like writing the book, finding a literary agent, finding a publisher, all of that was like, to me, a really monumental challenge. And it's kind of an unfair comparison because kayaking is like my thing. That's what I do. So maybe I was just much more comfortable on the whole Amazon expedition thing,
Sure.
where all of this stuff was like so out of my wheelhouse and I had to learn every step as I went. And I mean, probably like it feels more rewarding, probably because of those reasons. But
Mhm.
yeah, the book writing was definitely harder. And being honest about it, like the first draft of the book was like, so we woke up, we ate some breakfast, we went kayaking. And all the feedback I was getting from people was like, you have to put yourself into this book, you have to put your story in. And like, I don't mind being introspective, but I've never really been the type to share my introspections with people.
Yeah.
And so that was a huge challenge. But, you know, as soon as I started doing it, I could see how much better it made the book. So that
It
it was
was, well,
worthwhile.
I will say honestly, as you know, I've been growing as a nonfiction reader,
Mm.
and doing these live stream events have really expanded my reading in many ways. But one thing that I've sincerely noticed about these nonfiction books is just the sincerity that comes from people and the humanity that comes forth in these. I loved when you talked about like your family, and this was in the very beginning, but you were talking about, I'm trying to not spoil a lot of it, but in the beginning you were talking about your family and how, and you mentioned it in your presentation, and what you just talked about now about all these people saying you can't do this, you're not tall enough, big enough, whatever the enough is. And like that's very relatable, one, to a lot of humans, but in particular to a lot of women.
Hmm.
And being able to hear that from you who accomplished this amazing feat is really amazing. So that you bring a lot of heart to the book too, even if not an outdoorsy person can still relate and enjoy this book, which you did a great job with.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. It's good to
Yeah,
hear.
absolutely. No, for sure. And so what, hold on, I'm checking here. So what was, how you do a great job in the book of explaining the events like you did in the book, but what did you do to like plot it out, or to, stories you chose to include and not include? What was your editing or what was your writing process like when it came down to the book itself?
Yeah, it was. So I guess I felt kind of lucky in that the river adventure from point A to B, it was like kind of this nice chronological timeline to follow. And then, so many people were like, you've got to start with a cliffhanger, something like that. And so I wrote that chapter about Midge having trouble in the construction site. But then it somehow just felt like, it just felt not quite right starting that way. So I went back again and started with my introduction, which is more like, so it starts out with that letter that I wrote to my parents and
That was,
told, should I say it or will it ruin it for people who haven't
oh,
read it?
I mean, I think it's an excellent beginning to the book. I think it's one of the most clever bits to nonfiction that I'd ever read. And I opened it up and I was like, this is awesome.
Oh, awesome. Okay, yeah. So I wrote, before we left Lima, I'm like learning about all these ways that we might die on the Amazon River. And I was like, oh, this might be sort of irresponsible of me to go do this. And instead of saying, well, no, I'm not going to go, I was like, I know, I'll make it better by writing a letter to my parents. And I emailed the letter to a friend and said, hey, if something happens and I don't come back on the Amazon, give this to my parents. So I started the book with that letter because number one, it's really personal. And number two, I think it kind of sets the scene well for at least how dangerous I thought it might be going in here. And then I wanted to follow that up with some background on me and like my struggles, what was pushing me to do this Amazon River trip, even though it was starting to seem so dangerous. And so, yeah, I kind of jumped around getting the beginning right, and then tried to follow the chronology of the river as best that I could. And the stories that I chose to throw in there Some of them were to illustrate the dangerous stuff we face. Some of them were to illustrate like the kindness of people, because especially like after all my fears about the red zone, and the Ashaninka people are really sort of painted in this really bad light, and they have murdered quite a few people, but the more I got to understand them, the more I was like, well, I totally get why they're doing this.
Mhm.
And so I wanted to show like their good sides too. And they were all really kind to us. As soon as they realized that we were not a threat to them, they were like, yes, camp on our beach. Do you need food? Do you need this? And so I really wanted to make sure that that part came out in the book too. And so, yeah, I just tried to pick the moments that illustrated the things that I most wanted to get across, I guess.
So, what are you reading right now? Or a better question, also, that we've been asking a lot of authors is like, what media are you consuming during this quarantine?
Ah, okay. I am reading a lot right now. I'll put out
Yay!
a couple books. I'm reading okay, so there's a person with a name who's harder to spell and pronounce than ours, but he's an American Hungarian psychologist named Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. And yeah, very
Awesome.
difficult. It's like impossible to spell. But he wrote a book on like the flow state, or being in the zone, basically, where you're in
Mhm.
like this zone of consciousness where you're like totally absorbed in what you're doing and performing really well. So I think that's really cool and applicable to kayaking, although he writes about it in all walks of life. People get into it in work, walking, playing music, chess. And so I've been reading that. I've been reading Valerie Jarrett's new book. Is that her right name? Finding My Voice or
Oh,
something.
yes.
Which is pretty cool. And back when I didn't realize that people were watching on YouTube, and I was like, this is sad. No one else has joined the YouTube meeting or the Zoom meeting. I was thinking of that book because in one of Obama's first like presidential rallies, only 6 people showed up.
Yeah.
And she talks about that. And she's like, but he didn't care. He just went with it and with enthusiasm. So I was like, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to be like Obama.
I promise it's more than just the two of us. I swear. People are watching.
Okay. And then what else? I'm honestly like the first few weeks of coronavirus lockdown, I got so sucked into my computer and doing tons of Zoom kind of meetings and other stuff. And so in the last few weeks, I've been really trying to step back a bit. And so I'm
Good for
listening
you.
to more audiobooks. Like while I go running, I'll throw on an audiobook. Um, trying to read real books and like get away from the computer screen. But
Hmm.
it is hard. I think like all of us want to still be engaged, and the computers are the way to do that right now. But
Yeah.
then finding the balance of not spending the whole day sucked in.
So we'll end on this question, which I think
Okay.
is a really great one. Of what advice would you give, or what would you tell yourself at the beginning of that journey? You talked about learning and you talked about the mental already, but for somebody who's maybe thinking of doing something this adventurous or thinking of trying to do something this crazy and amazing, what would you say to them?
I think it would still go back to that idea of like, there's going to be people that doubt you. There's going to be people that tell you can't. And for me, even though I did a good job of not listening to that stuff, it still always had a little place in the back of my mind, and it would come out at bad moments, like in the middle of a hard whitewater section, this little voice would pop up. I just read in a magazine that small women can't paddle hard big water because they're just not strong enough. And it's like, no, get that out of my head. And so it's really hard to do, but I would encourage people to stay focused on what they want to do and shut out the rest of this noise as much as possible. And again, it's definitely not easy, but if you if you let this kind of negativity direct the course of your life, I think you're going to be a lot worse off than if you try for what you want. You still might fail. Maybe those people were right all along, but at least you will have tried and found out for yourself, as opposed to, okay, I'll back off and just do the safe thing here. And I don't mean safe in terms of like putting your life in danger, but safe in terms of not taking that risk of failure.
Yeah.
And yeah, just go for it. Don't listen to those people. And I don't know, do I have like 2 more minutes to answer this question?
Right.
I have like one more point, if you don't mind, a
Go
little bit
for it.
longer. So I was recently listening to Layla Ali talk, who is Muhammad Ali's daughter. And she
Awesome.
has, yeah, this amazing story. She got into boxing when she was 19, and she kind of secretly started going to the gym and she didn't tell anyone. And then she was getting close to her first competition. Her dad found out that she was doing this, and he came to the gym and told her, "You can't do this. Like, women can't box." And so here is her dad, number one. Like, I think all of us are affected when our dads tell us something. And like the greatest boxer of all time telling her she can't do it. And she somehow like had the strength to say, forget you, I'm doing this. She went on to win like 19 world titles in women's boxing and some or something like that. And so yeah, like what I want to share with people, and I don't know the best way to do this, is like how do we channel some Layla Ali in our lives? And when the best boxer in the world and our dad tells us we can't do something, but we want to do it so bad that we have the strength to say, screw you, I'm doing this anyway. Like that's what I want people to do.
That's the best answer. That's fantastic. I love it because it's such a, you saying it is such a theme in your book. And hearing you say it here just reiterates the amount of times that I heard it when I read the book and the amount of times that people are going to hear it when they read Amazon Woman. It's really an incredible thing that you've done and a great piece of work that you've given us that I'm so glad you had the courage not only to do this expedition, but then to share it with us. So thank you for the amazing book.
Yeah, thanks for reading it, and thanks for having me on tonight. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was amazing. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us this evening. Like I said, it's a great book, and you really should check it out. This non-athletic theater girl ended up really liking it, so I give it a great seal of approval. You can order it on tattercover.com, and it's going to be worth it, I promise. So you can join us for more live streams. Our website's open 24/7 now. And we're doing curbside pickup for the Denver area if you're willing to drive out and pick up your books. So we cannot thank you guys enough for joining us. Darcy, if you'll stay with me on for just a second, I'm going to end the live stream. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming out.
Yeah.